All right. So now we got all set up here. We're recording, ready to rock and roll. Like I said, I want to go over CDX Learning Objective 13-02, which is isolate engine noises and vibration. I'm going to pull my screen up here and kind of go over some of the CDX stuff on the screen. I highlighted some key points. When you see my screen, the problem with me highlighting key points is I'm not a very good highlighter. And by that, I mean, sometimes by the time I'm done highlighting a page, most of the page is highlighted because there's a lot of good information there. All right. It's already kind of chunked down anyways, but I want to point out some key features and some key points that we're going to talk about with diagnosing engine noise. So as you can see back here, I've got my Grand Prix in the shop here today. Battery charger hooked up to it. You see the fuse box is open. I'm already set up to kind of do a test on this one. And over here, I've got the Chevy Blazer in here. Same situation. It's set up ready to rock and roll. Reason I have them both in here is I want to show you a good and a bad. All right. Sometimes a lot of these tests, knowing how to do the test is only as good as understanding what the test is telling you and having examples. So something you guys will learn as you go through getting more experience being a technician, you create this database in your head and you don't even realize it. Some of you may be like me and I'll do something and then I don't do it for 6 months or a year and I kind of forget. And then all of a sudden I come back and I'm like, oh man, I already knew how to do that. I knew that. So you may want to do what I do. And I always keep a notebook in my toolbox and I keep a binder with some cheat sheets on some things. I don't expect you to remember all the readings on different gauges we're going to talk about. That's why I keep a cheat sheet on like vacuum gauge readings. I keep it in a binder in my toolbox. I keep a spiral notebook in my binder. And then that way, when I would have a car that came in with a really weird situation and I finally figured out what was wrong with it, I would kind of document it a little bit, just briefly, take some bullet points, you know, did this test, found this. And then that way in the future, if you ever have another car come in that's doing something similar, you have something to go back on. So a lot of times you'll hear me say, compare it to a known good vehicle. Well, that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to show you on a cranking sound diagnostic test on this Blazer that has a problem. And I'm going to show you on a car that does not have a problem so you can compare the two. All right. So that's where we're going to start with that stuff. That's the main goal for today. I'm also going to go over the assignment. You have an assignment to do today. It's posted in Schoology with the due date and the links and everything like that. I will pull it up on the screen, show you how to get to it, and I want to review it with you guys so you know what I want you to do. It's kind of going back a little bit to last week. It's engine component identification. You're basically going to come up with some, you know, pictures of some engine components and go from there. We'll go over that here in a little while. All right. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And I'm going to pull this up. And I'm going to minimize that so I can see where we're at. So diagnosing engine noises and vibrations. Noises and vibrations, guys, are, I mean, they're some of the hardest things to diagnose because it's hard to tell where they're coming from sometimes. And for example, is the vibration from the engine or is it from the driveline? Is the noise from the engine inside the engine, or is it from a component on the outside of the engine, or is it from, you know, maybe something else bolted to the engine, like a transmission problem? So they're very hard to diagnose. And these are skills that you will learn as you go. These are the things I always say, jot down some notes about. When you ran into a problem, you know, like, oh, this made that kind of sound, or this sounded like this when I did that. That way you'll know in the future, you kind of build that database of knowledge. All right, so you're going to find squeaks and rattles are tough in suspension. Every section of a car that we talk about through all 8 ASD categories have some sort of noise problems you can run into. Air conditioning system could have noise problems and smell problems. So steering and suspension can have squeaks and rattles and bangs and pops. Braking systems can have vibrations and shakes and squeaks and squeals and all kinds of noise. Engines can, drivelines can, transmissions can. So there's possibilities for noises and vibrations in every system. Right now, we're kind of trying to narrow it down to just engines, is what we're talking about. So knowing some of these things is really good. And what I do is I have a chart in one of my toolbox binders where I have a cheat sheet of different types of sounds and what it could be related to. So in case I forget, I've done it long enough now that I can usually tell that when I hear a loud knocking noise, it's probably from a worn or spun main bearing or connecting rod bearing. And then I have some skills and some experience to differentiate, well, maybe it's a main or maybe it's a rod, and some things you can do to narrow it down more. All right, so we'll go over that. So some things you might hear in an engine is a loud knocking noise. Definitely could be from a spun bearing of some form. All right, so if you have a spun bearing that basically takes, we talked about those engine bearings with those sleeves, that takes and actually spins in its location, it causes a problem, it wears funny, and it can cause a knocking noise. The clearance becomes too big, where if it's a connecting rod, the connecting rod is moving with too much clearance and slamming against the crankshaft. Main bearing, same thing. It's basically the crankshaft is moving and making a knocking noise against the caps or what was left of the bearing. So there's some different things there that you'll know. And to kind of narrow down some of that, I have highlighted right here on the screen, if you can see, I have highlighted a main bearing noise is generally deeper sounding than a rod bearing. You'll hear it. It'll be a real deep, real deep knocking noise. It's hard to explain until you hear it. And then you guys have heard some knocking noises here in the shop, and we'll go over some more too. I'll do a quick little video and send it out to you guys later of one of our vehicles out here with some bearing problems. If you guys remember listening to the RAV4, it clearly has an engine noise inside, internal, right? So a main bearing is generally deeper sounding than a rod bearing. Main bearings are also usually evenly spaced single knock. So it's a knock, 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 where a rod bearing usually typically makes a double knock, because it's going to make a knock when the crankshaft pulls it down, and it's going to make a knock when it goes up, because it's pulling it down and pushing it up, pulling it down and pushing it up. So it's doing a double knock noise. That's usually an indication that it's a rod bearing. Also, a way to tell if it's a rod bearing and which cylinder it's related to is you can go through and you can disable the ignition or fuel in that cylinder. And if it changes, you know it's that cylinder, and you know it's more than likely a rod bearing. So if I'm going through and I go with, nowadays we can just go with a scan tool most of the time, take a scan tool and disable fuel injectors or spark. We're pulling something away to eliminate the chance of having combustion. And once we take that combustion away, now the parts are usually just generally just kind of floating in the cylinder. They're not doing much. But when you have that combustion in that chamber, when that fire sparks and it creates that combustion, it slams against that piston, which slams the connecting rod down against the crankshaft. And if the bearing clearance is too big or the bearing's worn, you're going to hear that knock noise. So if we take combustion out of the picture, usually the sound will change. So in the old days, we would go through and we would take a test light and we could go through and ground out each spark plug wire and do a power balance test and see which cylinder made the noise change. Today, we use a scan tool most of the time. We can disable injectors or something in that cylinder. And if we're going through and nothing changes, and all of a sudden, say we get to cylinder 3 and the noise either goes away or changes significantly, chances are the problem is in that cylinder with that connecting rod or somewhere near it. All right, so there's some different tests that you'll learn to find that type of stuff. A light ticking noise, I have highlighted here in the green. A light ticking noise can be a valve lifter problem. A lot of you guys have probably heard that at some point. Sometimes when a car sits for a long time and the lifters bleed down, as they call it, basically the oil, the hydraulic oil leaks out of it, and it takes a minute for it to pump back up. You'll hear that tick, 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 tick. And then sometimes it'll go away once the lifter pumps up. Doesn't always. If a lifter's starting to fail and the seals are bad in it and it's bleeding down and not holding pressure, you'll hear a ticking noise. That ticking noise could also be on a car that needs maybe the valves adjusted on an older car and the clearance is too big. So you'll actually hear the lifters ticking or the rocker arm ticking on the valves, all right, if there's too much clearance. You'll usually hear that noise more from the camshaft cover and on the top of the engine. This is where your stethoscope comes in handy. You take that stethoscope and you put it in your ears, and then you put the other end down on the valve cover, and it's really loud up there, you know it's probably in the valve train, all right? A normal source of light ticking you may hear would be from fuel injectors. Fuel injectors on modern cars can be very noisy. Also, on direct injected cars nowadays, the new direct injected pumps, the mechanical fuel pumps on the engine, can be very noisy. They can make a really loud clicking or ticking sound that can be mistaken for other engine noises, but that's normal. So you have to, pay close attention to these different noises and locate the source, because you may have a noise that's actually normal. like a fuel injector ticks as it opens and closes. A high pressure direct injected pump makes clicking and ticking noises as it's operating. All right, so don't always assume the noise is not normal. It could be a normal noise. I have down here highlighted in the pink, a light knocking noise that comes under slight rocking of the throttle. So if you're just slightly rocking the throttle on and off, that usually is an indication of, and I use the word usually because there's always a chance that it's not, but usually more than likely it's caused by a collapsed piston skirt. That can be one of the problems, or a worn piston skirt. Because as you give it a little throttle, it kind of pushes that piston in that cylinder more, and you'll hear the skirt kind of hit. A whirling noise can be caused by worn bearings in something like the alternator, water pump, AC compressor, power steering pump, idler pulley, belt tensioner, some sort of an accessory on the front of the engine. So, you know, an easy way to determine if it's, you know, maybe a bearing noise in a accessory component on the engine would be to take the belt off and see if it goes away. Start it up real quick. Don't leave it run a long time so it doesn't overheat or anything. Start it up, noise goes away. Well, now you can start going through and spinning the AC compressor or belt tensioners or different accessories on the front of the engine that run off the belt to see where you feel the bearing. You can actually feel the noise. It's weird to say it that way, but you can actually feel the noise. You can feel the bearing roughness. So that's a way to diagnose some sort of a problem like that on the front. Sometimes just as easy as taking the belt off. Down here, I've highlighted in yellow, your biggest tool for diagnosing noises is a stethoscope. And you don't have to start out and have a really expensive, fancy electronic Bluetooth wireless scope. I've seen them now where they actually make pretty neat things where you can actually run Bluetooth to your smartphone and use your smartphone with headphones and things as a stethoscope, and you put the attachment lead and move it around the different things. That's pretty cool. But you guys can start out with a $15 or $20 manual stethoscope, mechanic stethoscope. They usually have that long, when we went over our tools, they have the long pointed end that you can stick down. You just have to be very, very, very careful around moving components. If you're sticking it on something that is moving and while it's running to try and find the noise, you have to make sure you don't get it tangled up in the belt or other moving components. But a stethoscope is a great tool to start out with as a mechanic. It should be in every entry-level technician's toolbox, in my opinion, because you can get it pretty affordable and it's going to help you diagnose problems significantly. All right. Down here a little bit, scooting down here, I have highlighted in blue when we talked a little bit ago about squeaky belts. Sometimes if you hear a squeaking noise, the easiest way is to take a squirt bottle with just plain water. No soap, no additives. They make things at the store called belt dressing and all this stuff. Don't use that stuff on belts. I don't even know why they still sell it. I don't know why it's out there. There is no chemical lubricant that you can spray on a belt to fix a problem. That's not the right way to do it. So stay away from that stuff. But if you take just a plain squirt bottle with just plain water in it, and if your car has multiple belts, if you go and spray each belt one at a time with just a couple sprays of water, if the noise goes away or changes, that's telling you which belt it's coming from. If it's just got one serpentine belt, spray it on the belt. If it goes away or changes, you know the belt is causing the squeak and it's not some other component in the engine. Because I've heard internal engine components squeak and sound so much like a belt. 6.2s, 6.2 liters in LS or LS truck motors, like you would see in a Cadillac Escalade, things like that. I've even seen them in the 5.3 truck motors. I've done a bunch of them, but the 6.2s were really bad there for a while, where if they had the active fuel management where they cut off 4 cylinders going down the road and turned them back on when you gave it gas so they could run on 4 cylinders or 8 cylinders, the lifters were having troubles where they were coming apart and they were chewing the cam lobes off. And we talked about cam lobes, how they have those ramps for the lift and then the base circle. Well, what they were doing is they were wearing the cam lobe off, and now that's changing how much the valve is open. It's changing the lift, the timing, all that stuff. And what was happening is air was squeaking past the valves improperly, and it was causing a squeaking noise, and you would have swore it was a belt squeaking. Took the belt off of it. First thing I did was take the belt off of the truck, and the first one I got, squeaking was still there. I took a stethoscope, stuck it to the valve covers. I found on the scan tool that cylinder 2 was misfiring, so I went right to where cylinder 2 would be with my stethoscope, and I could hear the squeaking noise around the cylinder head. So that led me into the right direction to further my diagnostics in that direction. So the squirt bottle test is a quick test to just spray on the belt and see if it is a belt. All right. And like I said, worst case, you can always pull the belt off real quick and double check. As you guys know, though, not all serpentine belts on these cars are easy to get to. So sometimes it's easier just to spray it. There's also noises and squeaks and creaks that can come from linkage of joints. We talked about a little bit ago, and suspension and steering stuff we learned about. Seniors, you guys learned a little bit about this last year. If you have a dry ball joint socket, it may squeak as you turn. You pump a little grease in it and it goes away. Well, you know the ball joint's the problem and you're replacing that ball joint. So the best way to do that is to spray them with some lubricant one at a time and operate it to identify which joint is causing the problem. Sometimes all it takes is to just take a little bit of grease and pump into the socket and see if it goes away. Vibrations are very, very difficult. Noises are hard to pinpoint. Vibrations are the worst. But you're going to run into a lot of vibration concerns you're going to have to do as a technician. You know, they can come from the engine or drivetrain. And by drivetrain, that's including everything from the transmission, the drive shaft, the differentials, the axles, the wheel bearings, the hubs, the wheels and tires, all that stuff. So they are very, very hard to diagnose. The best way to determine, you know, maybe where the vibration is coming from is start by trying to figure out the frequency of the vibration. In the dealership, if you guys go into a dealership route or, you know, even a bigger independent shop, a lot of guys nowadays use oscilloscopes to diagnose those problems. A special tool in the GM garage was a picoscope, and it was a lab scope that we hooked up to our computer, and we could put various sensors around the car. And some of the sensors were actually using optical pickup. We put a magnetic tape around a drive shaft that would pick up a signal from that, different types of clamps and sensors we can move around. And we would drive that car, and we use that tool looking at the frequencies on the chart that it would graph, and it could tell it, you know, we could use that. It didn't tell us what was wrong with the car, but it was another tool. We used it to narrow down, is this a frequency that's related to wheels and tires, the drive shaft or drive line, or is it something else? All right. So without all those fancy tools, you can still do this on most cars. But you still need to determine the frequency. So for example, if the frequency matches the engine RPM, I have this all highlighted in green right here too, if you guys want to follow along. If the frequency matches engine RPM, well, then you're looking for a fault in the crankshaft or parts connected to it. So parts connected to it is if you speed the crankshaft up, even if the belt's turning it off the harmonic balancer. So maybe it's an engine component, an accessory component on the front of the engine. Maybe it's an internal problem in the engine. All right. If it's changing with engine RPM while you're sitting still, you know, it's engine related or something that bolts to it. If the frequency matches tire speed, look for a fault in the tires, axles, hubs, bearings, things like that. So by that, I mean, if I'm driving it down the road and my speed goes up and the noise frequency changes and gets faster and faster and faster, well, then I'm looking for wheel bearings, I'm looking for axles, maybe a tire problem, things like that. All right. For the noise, if I have a vibration and all of a sudden I'll have a vibration and all of a sudden the vibration shows up at 45 miles an hour and it goes to 60 miles an hour, you know, that's generally the range where you're going to pick up and see, you know, tire vibrations are going to show up, usually around 40, 45 miles an hour up to 60, 65 highway speeds. I'm going to start looking at tires. So you guys will build that database of the frequencies and things like that. You'll know. All right. If it changes with vehicle speed, it's probably wheels, tires, or driveline related. If it changes with engine speed or RPM, it's probably engine related or something bolted to the engine. All right. Scroll down here a little bit. A good way to isolate a drivetrain is to get that vehicle up to a speed. And I'm right here where I have this highlighted in yellow for you guys. Place the transmission in neutral and basically coast. Right. So if you're driving down the road 55 miles an hour, let's just say that's when the vibration happens, put it in neutral, let the engine idle. You know, if that vibration is still present, the issue is probably related to the wheels, tires, or axles, because now you've made the engine idle and it's just sitting there coasting, but you still have the vibration. The only things that are still actually working hard would be the driveline, axles, wheels, tires, things like that. All right. If the vibration goes away, raise the engine RPM while you're still coasting. You know, If the issue comes back then, the vibration comes back, it's probably with the engine. This is just something you can do on a preliminary test drive. Sometimes I just do this. Customer comes in for vibration noise concern. I go out on test drives. It's one of the first things I do. Get up to speed, kick it in neutral, rev the engine up and down a little bit, see if the noise goes away, things like that. So those are some good tips, all right? Now, getting into cranking sound diagnostics, that's mainly what I wanted to go over today. And then this is the first step before I would even do a compression test or, you know, any of these other engine mechanical testing. The easiest thing to do is do a cranking sound test. I have literally no tools out here other than battery chargers just to keep my battery charged while we were cranking it, and a jump pack on this one because we know the battery's junk in this one. So I have no tools out here. This is a simple test you can do with very little tools. You can do it anywhere to kind of give you an idea. It doesn't give you answers, but it gives you an idea of maybe I have a compression problem, maybe I don't. Maybe a tune-up will fix my problem, maybe it won't. This is kind of just a good idea. Give you a roundabout, you know, place to start. So, like it says here, engine noises give you, the technician, an insight to the condition of the engine. You know, remember when we talked about the events of what a four-stroke engine needs and all the things it needs for that to happen, compression is one of the 5 critical events. If we do not have compression, but we have spark, fuel, and everything else, we're still going to have a misfire if we don't have compression. If we have compression, but we don't have fuel or spark, we're going to have a misfire, and it's going to cause an uneven running engine. It's called a rough running engine. All right. So if a compression is even low in a cylinder, we have some compression, but it's low. If it's not enough to compress that air fuel mixture like it should, it will not combust properly and it causes a misfire. All right. A lot of times people think, oh, it's running rough. It just needs a tune up. It just needs a tune up. I can tell you guys, I wish I could tell you guys how many times I've seen guys just do a tune up on a car and it doesn't fix it. All right. That's why there's a diagnostic process. Sure, maybe the car needed a tune-up, 100,000 miles, never had one. It probably didn't hurt to do a tune-up on it, but that didn't fix the problem. So this is a quick test you can do with hardly any tools, and it only takes a few minutes to do to give you an idea of how that compression is in that engine. All right. So when you do that, it's basically going to tell you if the compression is similar across all cylinders. And there's things I've mentioned to you guys before, and we can get into later about doing a relative compression test with a lab scope. We can hook our lab scope up to the car and the ignition system, get a trace, figure out where cylinder 1 is, and we can use that waveform to see the evenness of the cranking for the cylinders. We basically can look at the draw of the starter, because remember, if there's a low cylinder, the starter's not going to have to work as hard to push it and compress that up if there's low compression in that cylinder, and you'll see a change in the graph. All right. But to just do a simple test like this without any fancy tools, this can give you a lot of information. All right. Some of the noises you may hear while you're doing your cranking, maybe a misaligned starter, a knock of a spun bearing, low compression. If it's uneven cranking, it can give you, you know, that tells you you have low compression in the cylinder. Fast cranking could be caused by a broken timing belt, bent valves, or just no compression in a cylinder. I've had cars come in where the timing belt broke. First thing I did was go out and crank it. And if the engine spins over really fast, there's a good sign that there's no compression and there's internal damage, right? Or a whole bunch of other mechanical problems. So just mainly, I want you guys to remember that engine problems have associated noises, and noises give the technician clues to help locate and identify them. You'll build that database as you guys go. So one of the first things we need to do the cranking sound demonstration here is we need to understand that the sound of the starter cranking the engine over is going to give us an indication of the engine's compression. We're using the starter noise to tell us a general idea of what the compression is in that engine. So when the starter's cranking, if it makes an even cranking sound, then you know the compression is similar. It's not giving you a reading, but it's letting you know, hey, the compression is pretty similar across all cylinders. They may be low in all cylinders, but they're pretty similar across all cylinders because it's even. All right. So remember, as each piston comes up on that compression stroke, it is starting to load the starter because it's coming up and it's trying to squeeze all that air fuel mixture into a really tight space. So it's really putting a lot of strain on that starter to crank that up there. So now if we have a low compression in that cylinder. It's going to go up real easy, and it's not going to put a strain on that starter. So you're going to listen for that starter cranking sound. First thing we need to do is you need to disable the engine from starting. There's a few different ways you can do this. Most late model fuel injected cars, like for this one example, this 3800 and this Grand Prix, you can put it in the clear flood mode. And even this Blazer, I believe, you can do the same thing. Clear flood mode. Basically what you're going to do is you hold the throttle all the way open and crank it. All right, when you do that, that basically sees, the computer sees the throttle position's wide open. It automatically disables the fuel from spraying because it doesn't want the car to start with the throttle wide open. So if you have, they call it clear flood mode, because if the car was flooded, you could do that. It won't spray any more fuel. It'll pump the fuel out and it clears the flooded condition out. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it, which I like to do, is I usually just go and I find a fuel an injection relay for fuel injectors or for a fuel pump. Usually I just pull a fuel pump relay or fuse. Relay is usually a little bit easier to pull out. You can also go around to each injector and pull all the injector connectors off, but that takes time. And a lot of these cars now, they're hidden underneath the intake manifolds and you can't get to them. Disable the ignition system is another common way where you're just disconnecting, maybe pulling a fuse or relay for the ignition control module or the ignition system in general, the coil packs. Unplugging the coil packs on a car. The only reason I don't like to do that is you're still dumping fuel into the cylinder. So I would rather disable the fuel injectors if at all possible. All right. Then once we disable it, we're going to take this, we're going to hold the throttle to the floor. We're going to crank the engine and we're going to listen to the sound. If you're not sure if it's supposed to sound that way, find another similar vehicle that you know doesn't have a problem, and they call it a known good vehicle, and compare to that. So we're going to get started right here. We're going to jump in here and we're going to listen to this and see how it sounds. Hopefully you guys can hear this. I hope you can. So I already went ahead before we started. I located under the fuse block under here, I located the fuel pump relay, pulled the fuel pump relay. I cranked it over to make sure all the fuel ran out of the fuel rail and everything so it won't start. Well, it shouldn't start. All right. So let's listen to this. I'm going to hold the throttle wide open, and then we're going to listen to this cranking sound. All right, do me a favor, somebody. Type in the chat box and let me know if you could hear that. Let me take a look here. You guys heard it? Okay. Just curious because I'm using my AirPods here, so I don't know if you'd hear it. So since you heard it, I see Andrew. Everybody's saying they hear it. Andrew, he went a little further, said sounds pretty even. All right. So that's telling me that that is probably a good cranking engine. And I'll tell you what, I should have taken you out of share screen mode, and I didn't. I apologize. It sounded pretty even. So I'll go ahead and do this again for you real quick. It sounded real even, sounded pretty crisp. So let's do it one more time. So as you guys can hear, I can tell pretty much from this car that it doesn't have really any compression problems because it's cranking nice and even. It's all the way across the board cranking nice and even. The reason we hold the throttle wide open, and you'll learn when we do this on compression testing and stuff too, you're making sure that you can just get as much air in that engine as possible so it can compress as much as possible to get a good accurate reading, all right? Now, we're going to go over to the Blazer, which we know has a problem. So bear with me while I cruise you guys on over here. Get you set up. All right. So this vehicle does have a drivability problem. It misfires. It runs really rough. Hard to start, especially when cold. So a lot of those things right there, I hear, I'm like, well, it could be an ignition problem. It could be a fuel problem because, you know, problems in those systems can cause all that. They can all be related to temperature, can kind of, you know, relate to that stuff too and affect that. But also I'm thinking compression because we need to have fuel, air, spark, and compression, you know, to make this work. So I'm thinking compression as well because that can be temperature sensitive. If it's got some compression, but it's weak and it's hard to fire it, maybe when it's warmer, it'll actually seal up a little tighter and create more compression as opposed to when it's cold. Because remember, guys, when it's cold, things, you know, kind of shrink up. So the piston rings and pistons, the aluminum pistons, don't fit as tight. Maybe the valves don't seat as tight if there's a little bit of a problem. Once things heat up, everything's going to expand a little bit. So, you know, it could be related to a compression problem too. So I'm going to give you guys a heads up. I know it has a compression problem. That's why I'm going to use this one. All right. And we're going to diagnose this in later videos and meetings. And hopefully when you guys get back here, we can fix it. So I'm going to do a cranking test on this. Once again, I have a jump pack on it because I know the battery's weak. I shouldn't say weak. It's no good. I've already removed the fuel pump. I went in here and found fuel pump relay, just pulled it out and set it off to the side. So it shouldn't start. All right. So let's take a listen to this one. Throttle's wide open, it's in park, brake is on. Now we're going to crank it. No, we're not. We're going to move the jump pack cable first. All right. Probably start a lot better now. All right. Throttle open. I'm going to crank it. Now listen for this sound. I'm going to do that one more time for you guys. The reason I don't keep going with it is you don't want to overheat the starter. That's putting a lot of draw on the starter. So you don't want to get the cables hot, the battery cables hot, the starter hot and overheat it. So you always want to crank it for, you know, no more than 10 seconds or so. And then let the starter cool down for, you know, 30 seconds to a minute before you do it again. All right. So I don't want to overheat the starter, but as you guys could probably hear in there, it did not sound very even. All right. It had kind of like, I call it like a hump to it. It would crank kind of even, then it hit a weird spot. And then it would crank kind of even and hit a weird spot. That's telling me that I probably more than likely have some sort of a compression problem in this engine. Doesn't tell me where, but it's just my starting point. Let me do this cranking again for you so you guys can hopefully hear it. All right. Do me a favor again, guys. A couple of you guys type in the chat box for me and see if, let me know if you heard that. Nice. Hunter says he could hear it. All right, Andrew. All right. I like that, Landon. It's bad. It is definitely bad, right? So you guys could hear in there that it was not very even. It was up and down, up and down. What's happening is that starter, when it's pushing that piston up into that cylinder, when it gets to the cylinder where there's low compression, it pushes it a lot quicker. So the sound spikes up and then it comes back down because the next cylinder's on its compression stroke and so forth and so forth. So that's just a quick, simple test. I had no fancy tools. You could do this in your driveway at home. You could do this in a parking lot, anywhere. No fancy tools required. I do always recommend when we're doing any kind of cranking related thing that we always, you know, have a jump pack on the car or, you know, a battery charger on it because we want to keep the battery up and charged. But other than that, we didn't really use any fancy tools or anything around here. All right. When we're done with that, we always want to put the relays or whatever we did to disable it from starting. We want to put that back together to the way it was. All right. I'm going to do that off camera, not waste your time watching me put a relay back in the box for now. I think you guys can handle that. But that's the biggest thing is that tells you a lot right there. And we compared a good one and a bad one. And that's going to tell you a lot of what's going on in the engine. Right now, I know I need to further my diagnostics. People say, well, does this tell you anything? It didn't tell me what's wrong with it. No, it didn't, but it told me I have a problem. and it told me that I'm more than likely going to go look right at compression. I'm probably just going to go ahead and avoid even checking spark and fuel. It's always a good idea to do that, but knowing that I heard it this bad, uneven, I'm probably just going to do a quick compression test and see what's going on. All right. We also, since this is an OBD2 vehicle, we can plug a scan tool into it under the DLC, under the dash, run a diagnostic check on it, see if there's any codes. Maybe it'll give me a cylinder misfire code, so I can go right to that cylinder, or at least right to that side of the engine, that bank of the engine, and get a jump start on it. So it's just a quick little test to give you a starting point. And you guys will see as we go through this week and next week doing some testing and some videos that I'm going to do with you guys. Compression testing, cylinder leak testing, talking about that type of stuff. You know, this is your first step. So what I want to do here, see if I can get this screen pulled back up. You know, here is your skill drill for in the future. If you ever forget, need to come back, here's your skill drill, just kind of showing you the steps of what you're doing there. All right. So now that test is done. I'm not going to bombard you with 3 or 4 demos in one day and all that stuff. I know you guys are, you know, got a lot of assignments and stuff to do anyways. So the next thing I want to do is I want to show you guys this assignment. So let me make sure this is updated. And I have my screen sharing here. Hopefully you guys can all see it. I'm on Schoology. I'm coming right to our post here for the day, 11/2/20 p.m. class. I wanted you to review that learning objective before we talked about this today. Just so we were kind of prepared. There was no really any assignment you had to do with it. I just wanted you to kind of be prepared what we were talking about. Join the Zoom meeting today with the time. We went over that. And now your homework here. It's the engine component ID project. I call it a project, but it's not like a big project. All right. But it's going to be due tomorrow by 12 p.m. by the beginning of class tomorrow. All right. So here's your information down here. I've got your assignment and I have your scoring guide right here. So if you're curious on what, you know, I'm going to be looking for here, here it is. Keep this, download this stuff, save it to your Office 365 OneDrive. You know, you can email this back to me or share it through Office 365, whichever works easier, comes to my email. I'll open it up. I'll take a look at it. I'll grade it. I'll put a grade in the grade book for you guys, and I'll even send it back to you with any comments or corrections or anything I have on there. And keep this for your portfolio, because this will be something that maybe, you know, down the road, you can use this as a portfolio. You guys know me. I'm all about trying to combine things, you know, kill multiple birds with one stone. I want to make sure that everything we do is worthwhile in multiple ways. So there's a project in the portfolio that's called Break It Down, and it's talking about different, you know, breaking a concept down in your class. Well, this is kind of that. Or you may be able to use it for a Teach Me project and teach your own lesson in here as a portfolio project on a different component. So I'm just giving you a little hint. Hold on to it once you're done with it. Don't delete it. Just keep it saved. All right. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up the assignment, and I'm going to pull this up. And here's the assignment outline. So the assignment outline, you guys have access to this, is, you know, the objective is demonstrate knowledge of spark ignited engine components. You can create a presentation. I use PowerPoint. I know a lot of you guys use Google Slides, whatever, Prezi, whatever you want to do, just whatever works easiest to save it to your OneDrive. Remember, we don't use Google Docs and everything here. Save it to your OneDrive, and then you can share it to me or email it to me or whatever. So you're going to make a presentation. All right. Each engine component should have its own slide. So for each engine component, I'll give you one, for example, like a piston. A piston should have its own slide. It should be the piston slide. It should have a picture of a piston, at least one picture of the component. So if it was a piston, have at least one picture. You can put more. That's absolutely fine. The name of the component, a definition of the component. So that definition can be a textbook definition, but for more points, if you want to, you know, get a little bit more points there, if you put a textbook definition and then a definition into your own words explaining it, try to think about you're presenting this to somebody that has no idea what a piston is. here's the vocabulary term, and let me explain it to you so you can understand it. That works too, but as long as you have a definition, you're meeting the requirements. Where is it located? So where would that be located in the engine? Give me a description of that. And what is the purpose of the component? Just a brief, what does it do? Why is that piston there? All right. So here are some components I want you to go with. All right, engine block. I mean, we could go, there's all kinds of little components in engine, but these are the main ones. Engine block, crankshaft, flywheel, or flex plate, depending on if it's automatic or standard transmission. Harmonic balancer, oil pan, bearings, bearing caps, connecting rod. I'm not being specific on the bearings. It could be a main bearing, connecting rod bearing. If you want to go into detail and put both on there, that's great. But I just want an example of bearing inserts, bearing caps, connecting rod, piston, piston rings, all of them, the compression rings, the oil control rings, things like that. Camshaft, timing belt or chain. You want to put both on there, that's great. You just want to pick one, that's okay too. Camshaft bearings, cylinder head, a valve, lifter, push rod, rocker arm, intake manifold, exhaust manifold, and valve cover. So realistically, I will probably see something along the lines of 22 slides. You'll have a cover slide with your name, the project name, the date, and then you'll have 21 components, all right? You don't have to make a whole essay out of this thing, all right? Just give me what I'm asking for up there. And that, again, is one picture at minimum, the name of the component, a definition of the component, where it's located, and what its job is or what its purpose is. So here's your outline you can go back to. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here and I'm going to show you the rubric that I had Mr. Shaw kind of help me with, because I thought to myself, you know what? I can score this by meeting the requirements, but I like to have a scoring guide that we can incorporate into our portfolio so they get portfolio credit for this as well. All right, so here's your rubric that Mr. Shaw helped me make up. So here's what kind of the expectations are. For you to get, you know, a 4 in everything, here's your top section up here, what you would need. All right. A 3, a 2, or a 1, that's going to be out of 20 points. All right. So here's the requirements right here. Title slide with name, 21 components, 21 slides. Did they meet that or not? Name, image, accurate name of each component, clear image and picture, 1 minimum. It's been met or exceeds, you get the highest score, and so forth and so forth. Definition, accurate definition and interpretation of the component. Accurate textbook definition, including explanation in student's own words, or if he's wanting me to proficient level, accurate textbook definition, and so forth and so forth. The location and purpose. Did you identify where it was located? Did you explain the purpose? For the highest score, location and purpose clearly met and identified and explained, and so forth down, all right? Spelling and technical vocabulary. This is where I had Mr. Shaw help out with this, because there's certain components that we have to meet portfolio requirements. That's why I got him on board to help us out. Correct spelling. Guys, use spell check. Use spell check. I use it every day, all right? Appropriate use of technical vocabulary terms. So if you want the highest score, does not contain any spelling errors. Appropriate use of technical vocabulary, and then so forth. The proficient level contains a few errors, mostly appropriate, and then so forth and so forth. All right. So there's your scoring guide or rubric for this little project I want you guys to work on. Right now, I'm going to stop this sharing the screen. There we go. And I got a chat in here. Heard it. Okay. I am going to let you guys go. I'm done. I wanted to do that demo for a couple reasons. I'm going to be honest with you. I miss you guys being here. I miss being in the shop. I know I give you guys a hard time sometimes, say you drive me crazy, but I wish you guys were here driving me crazy, because it kind of gets a little lonely and boring in here. It's a lot easier to just show you guys right here, bring you over to the car and do it. It's a little tougher to do this whole camera setup, but I wanted you guys to at least try to experience some shop time as much as possible. Hopefully for just a few weeks, and then we get you guys back here and we'll get rock and rolling on your task sheet again, on your task list. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys for checking it out. Remember, always check your Schoology for posts, for updates. if you're bored, look on our Instagram page. I'm always trying to post some different things up there. Some of it may not be that cool. Some of it might be cool. I'm just got my Duramax in the shop last night. I'm going to start putting fuel lines on it because I need the truck sooner than I expected. So I'm going to start putting fuel lines on it. Check Instagram. I'll post some pictures and some things through there in the story. So keep an eye on that stuff in the Facebook page. And as always, guys, reach out to us whenever you have any questions or anything we can help you with. Mr. Highlands is here still. I'm here. If I'm doing things, Mr. Highlands is open and he can help out, and vice versa. Don't be afraid to send an email to me, him, both of us, one of us, whatever we need to do to help. And we can set up, some one-on-one Zoom meetings. We can set up some emails going back and forth, a phone call, whatever we need to do to try to help you guys out. All right. So does anybody have any questions on what we talked about today with basic overview of engine noises and vibrations and how to do a quick cranking compression test, or sorry, a cranking sound diagnostic test? If you do, you can either unmute yourself or type it in the box right now.
My truck, when the motor's under, when I rev up, it starts to like squeak.
Say that one more time.
When I rev my truck up, when I'm trying to drive it, getting up to 50, 45, 50,
yeah,
there's a squeak coming from the motor.
So when you're about 45, 50, speeding up 45, 50 miles an hour, you have a squeak from the motor?
Yeah.
And it's only on acceleration. It's not like just idling or cruising. It's only when you're actually speeding up.
It's only when I'm accelerating.
Only when you're accelerating. See, so that's a process where we'd have to narrow it down. We would have to, if it's squeaking, maybe pull the belt off and drive it real quick, or see if we could duplicate it in the shop, things like that, because it could be so many different things. That's an example of where the electronic stethoscope would come in handy, because you could put the leads on different things while you drive it and check and see where you hear the noise coming from. So that would be an advantage of that. But
all right.
Anybody else have any other questions? Also, do you guys, if you have any questions on the assignment, I mean, I tried to explain it and lay it out for you guys, but if there's a question you're not sure of or something I missed, please feel free to ask now. If you remember a question, as soon as we hang up here off the Zoom meeting, no big deal. Just shoot me an email and I'll try to answer it then too. Just remember, check in the Schoology. The assignment's in there. It's due tomorrow before class starts. And we'll see what we're going to do tomorrow. I might have a meeting for you again tomorrow. I might just wait till Wednesday and go from there. But if everybody's good, I'm good. I'm going to let you guys go. All right. So thank you guys all for joining in. I appreciate it. Try to make this somewhat as normal as we can. Try to get you here in your favorite place. I like to think most of you guys really enjoy being in this, fancy shop. So try to get you out here the best we can. All right. Remember, if you have any other questions, do me a favor, just shoot me an email and go from there. All right. All right, guys. Have a good day. Wortman out.